Watch your sister's wedding online. My parents texted, so I stepped back and watched it fall. I stared at the message on my phone like it had been sent to the wrong number. No greeting, no explanation, just a live stream link, a password, and a time. The sender, my parents. The subject, my younger sister's wedding. I wasn't invited. I hadn't been included in any of the planning, not a single call, update, or even the courtesy of a text in the weeks leading up to it. And yet here it was an impersonal link, as if I were some old co-worker or a distant cousin. Not the sister, not the firstborn, not Madison. My name is Madison Beer. I'm 28 years old, living in Chicago, and working as a lead architectural designer for a small but ambitious firm that specializes in converting historic buildings into modern residential spaces. I've lived here since college, building a life out of clean lines and long nights, one blueprint at a time. I love what I do. I love the silence of design, the way you can draw something meaningful out of a mess, organize chaos into structure. It's one of the only places in my life where I feel seen for what I bring to the table. Unlike at home, I grew up in a town just outside New Haven, Connecticut, classic white fences, cut grass, and polite neighbors who never asked too many questions. My parents, Stephen and Clarice, are both dentists who run their own private clinic, which they treat less like a medical practice and more like a legacy brand. Appearances matter. Everything was curated. The house, the smiles, the stories we were allowed to tell about ourselves. Taylor, my younger sister by 3 years, was the star of that world. She was bubbly, emotional in all the right ways, and gifted at saying exactly what people wanted to hear, even when she was little. She seemed to intuit what earned praise and what didn't, and I didn't when I brought home art projects or straight A's. The reaction was always polite, never celebratory. When Taylor brought home a drawing with stick figures and glitter glue, it was framed and put on the fridge for weeks. I remember once overhearing my mom say to a neighbor, "Madison doesn't need much. She's self-motivated." That was their way of justifying the difference. They weren't neglecting me. They said they were giving me space, but space turns into silence, and silence turns into absence. It's a quiet kind of erasure. Taylor and I were close as kids, or at least I thought we were. We shared a room for years, and she used to beg me to tell her stories before bed. I remember braiding her hair before school dances, helping her rehearse speeches when she ran for class secretary, even secretly editing her college essays. But the older we got, the more she leaned into the role that had been carved out for her, the delicate one, the social one, the one the family revolved around. I became the backdrop. When I left for college in Chicago, it felt like an escape. I worked 2 jobs, finished my architecture degree with honors, and landed my dream internship at 22. My parents didn't come to graduation. Taylor had an allergy scare that weekend, and they couldn't risk traveling. I didn't argue. I'd stopped arguing years earlier. I kept calling on birthdays and holidays. I sent gifts. I stayed polite. I thought if I stayed patient, maybe things would even out. 2 years ago, Taylor got engaged to a man named Jordan. He was quiet, well-dressed, came from money. I met him once at a Thanksgiving dinner where I was seated at the kids' table while Taylor gave a toast. Even then, I noticed how their eyes shifted when I spoke, like they were hoping I'd keep it short. I still remember what Taylor said that night. "It's just easier when Madison does her own thing. She's not really into family stuff." That wasn't true. I'd just gotten used to not being asked. In the months leading up to the wedding, I tried to reach out. I offered to help with the venue design. I sent over some style boards when I heard they were thinking of a minimalist theme. Taylor never responded. Then, my mom told me over the phone casually, like she was mentioning the weather, that they were keeping the wedding party small and hoped I'd understand. I said I did. I didn't, but I said I did. And now, this message, a live stream link, no seat at the table, no role in the ceremony, no name on the program, just a link, just watch from wherever you are. What they didn't realize, what they never seemed to understand, is that people don't break when you scream at them. They break when you pretend they don't exist. The moment I closed that text, I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I didn't even move. I just sat there, hands resting on the edges of my kitchen island, watching the blue morning light spill through the windows of my loft. Thinking, so this is how it ends, not with a confrontation, not even with a conversation, but with a password-protected link, a wedding I wasn't invited to, a family I no longer belonged to. I took a deep breath, opened my laptop, and typed a single email. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't spell out years of resentment or emotional bruises. I just wrote, "Thank you for the update. I won't be attending." That was it. No one replied. I didn't expect them to, because in their minds, I had always been the one who opted out, the distant one, the difficult one, the one who never quite fit. That weekend, I canceled the days off I'd quietly saved in case they changed their minds. I deleted the Pinterest board where I had gathered design inspiration for Taylor's reception florals, seating cards, a clean ivory on forest palette she'd once told me she liked. I had imagined creating something elegant for her, something timeless. I didn't know why I had kept working on it long after she stopped answering my calls. Maybe I just wanted to prove I was worth including instead of mourning. I redirected my energy. I got to the office early Monday morning, pulled out the Thornbridge condo redevelopment proposal I'd been working on for months, and finished the final renderings, when my boss, Dana, walked by. She stopped, eyes widening at the quality of the draft. She didn't say much, just nodded slowly, but I knew it meant something. At work, there were no favorites, just results. That week, a colleague named Eli invited me to join a late-night design sprint on a new client project. I said yes. We stayed until nearly 2 a.m., laughing over half-finished mock-ups and vending machine coffee. For the first time in months, I felt light, not happy, not healed, just light, like I had taken a step out of something dark. But the universe doesn't let you walk away that easily. On Friday, a voicemail from my dad appeared during lunch. I almost didn't listen. His voice was tight, performative, like he was trying to sound concerned. "We noticed you didn't respond to the wedding invitation. It's not too late to join. You could still catch a flight if you wanted," as if I had simply forgotten, as if a live stream link without warning was an acceptable form of invitation, as if their silence hadn't already spoken loud and clear. I didn't respond. 2 days later, a new message from Taylor popped up on my phone. No greeting, no emotion, just, "If you do choose to watch the ceremony, please don't comment on the chat. A few people still think you're traveling for work." I stared at it for a long time. That wasn't a request. It was damage control. It was a demand to stay invisible. In that moment, I saw it clearly. This wasn't just about a wedding. It never had been. It was about control, image, maintaining the fiction. They didn't want me to be part of their lives unless I could play the role they assigned, the quiet sister, the one who stays in the background, the one who never causes scenes, even when she's erased entirely. I didn't click the live stream. I didn't need to see what I already knew. Instead, I walked to the lake, Chicago was cold that morning, the wind sharp enough to sting your skin, but it cleared my head. I sat on a bench near the water and let the silence wrap around me like armor. That's when I made the decision. I wouldn't play along anymore. Not with the calls that only came when they needed something. Not with the forced pleasantries at holidays. Not with the empty gestures they used to make themselves feel generous. If being part of this family meant erasing myself, then I'd rather stand alone. That week, I signed up for a solo design retreat in Oregon. 3 weeks later, I was hiking through damp pine forests and sleeping in a cabin with no signal, no texts, no calls, just space. Space to think, to unlearn, to rebuild. What shocked me wasn't how lonely it felt. It was how peaceful it was. The further I stepped away from them, the clearer things became. I wasn't broken. I wasn't dramatic. I wasn't hard to love. I had just been trying to bloom in soil that never wanted me to grow. 3 days after the wedding, I got a text from Carter Miller, one of Taylor's childhood friends. We hadn't spoken in years, but he used to call me Mads back when we all spent summers at our grandparents' lake house, back when things felt simple and people hadn't yet learned to erase me in public while pretending to love me in private. His message was short, without greeting or hesitation. You probably don't want to hear this, but the wedding was a mess. You were right not to go. That was it. I didn't need more. I didn't need details or stories. I just stared at the screen for a long moment, not out of shock, but out of recognition. Someone had finally said the thing out loud, not to argue, not to justify, but just to name what had always been true. Later that night, another message arrived, this one from my cousin Riley, who had attended the wedding out of obligation rather than loyalty. Her text was longer. They told people you were sick, said you had planned to come but canceled last minute. But folks noticed. Your name wasn't in the program. You weren't mentioned in the speeches. Even Wesley's mom pulled your parents aside. I think she could tell something was off. I sat at my kitchen counter with a glass of cold water in my hand, staring through the cabinets like they were transparent. It wasn't the lie that stung. It was how smoothly they told it. They had created a version of reality where I simply didn't matter, where my absence was conveniently explained and swiftly ignored. And once again, it had only worked because I stayed quiet, at work. I didn't say anything to anyone. I kept my head down and buried myself in the Thornbridge project, drafting render after render, adjusting lighting angles and facade options until the hours blurred. There was something about design that made me feel grounded, like I could still control something when everything else was spinning, within the walls of my studio. I wasn't someone's daughter or someone's forgotten sister. I was a professional. I was trusted that week. Dana asked me to lead a client pitch she couldn't attend. I accepted. The meeting went better than expected, and the contract was signed on the spot. I walked home that evening through icy Chicago wind with my coat zipped high and my spine a little straighter. That's when the realization hit me. Not all validation comes from blood. Every time they had tried to shrink me, I had quietly grown somewhere else, but just as I was starting to find clarity. Another text arrived, this time from Taylor herself. I heard what Riley said. I didn't mean to hurt you. Things just got complicated. You always make things complicated. That last sentence stuck to me like static. It wasn't an apology. It was an accusation wrapped in passive language, as if my very existence was disruptive, like I was the problem that needed to be managed. I didn't reply, not because I was angry, but because I was tired. The next morning, my mother called. I let it ring. She called again, then again. The third time, I answered. Her voice was tight, rehearsed, the kind of calm people wear when they're trying to hold a script together. Your father and I think it would be good to have a dinner, just the four of us, to reset things. I said nothing. She kept going. I know the wedding wasn't perfect, but Taylor's still your sister. Family is still family. That line again. Family is family. A phrase used to bypass accountability, to pressure people into compliance under the guise of tradition. I stayed silent. She asked if I'd come. I said I'd think about it, and I did. I thought about my father's speech at Taylor's engagement party, where he called her the brightest light in our family and didn't mention me at all. I thought about the wedding designs I offered to help with, the ones Taylor replaced with Pinterest screenshots before ghosting me entirely. I thought about the link they sent, the coldest proof that I was never really expected to be there. In the end, I didn't go to that dinner. Instead, I made a reservation at a restaurant I had always wanted to try, but never did because it felt too beautiful to sit in alone. I dressed up. I ordered a glass of white wine and a risotto dish I would have once called too expensive for a Tuesday night. I sat at the bar. No one stared. No one whispered. I toasted quietly, not to closure, not to revenge, but to myself. I had spent years fighting for a seat at a table I didn't build, asking for crumbs from people who thought withholding love made them powerful. But that night, I realized something simple and irreversible. I didn't need their table. I could build my own, and for the first time in my adult life, I had no desire to look back. 2 weeks after the wedding, the silence from my family grew louder than any fight we'd ever had. No follow-up, no check-in, no acknowledgement that I had missed what was supposed to be the most important day of their year. It was as if they had folded me out of the picture entirely, quietly and efficiently. I didn't chase it. I didn't call to ask how it went or pretend to care about details that were never meant to include me. I kept working. I took long walks by the lake after dark. I started journaling again, something I hadn't done since college, and the pages filled quickly with thoughts I hadn't realized were still sitting inside me, waiting to be unpacked. I didn't write about anger. I wrote about clarity, about what happens when you finally stop asking to be understood. One cold Friday morning, as I was preparing for a site visit, I got a call from Eli, my colleague. He was supposed to join me, but canceled last minute and sent someone else from our team. The replacement was a junior associate named Naomi, who had just moved to Chicago from Portland and barely knew the building codes, let alone our firm's culture. But she showed up early, asked thoughtful questions, and surprised me with how quickly she grasped the essence of the project afterward. We stopped for coffee, and I don't remember how the conversation shifted, but somewhere between design ideas and stories about concrete delivery delays, I told her casually, carefully, that I'd recently chosen not to attend my sister's wedding. She didn't ask why. She just nodded and said, "Some rooms aren't worth walking into, even if your name is on the door." I blinked at that. It stayed with me, not as a quote to repeat, but as a reminder that not everyone needs context to offer clarity. That night, I opened my personal email for the first time in days and found a message buried beneath promotions and newsletters. The subject line read, "Something you should know." It was from Madison Grant, a distant friend of Taylor's from college, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Her message was polite, but direct. She said she had overheard a few people at the wedding wondering why I wasn't there. Apparently, Taylor had told several guests I was traveling abroad on a last-minute design contract and didn't want to be disturbed. She even claimed I had sent my love via a voice message. I hadn't. Of course I hadn't. I hadn't said anything to anyone. It was a fabricated story, a clean cover for a family that had never tolerated complication. I sat at my desk for a long time, rereading the message, feeling the familiar weight of being rewritten by people who didn't ask permission to use my name. Then I closed the email and did something unexpected. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because for the first time, I didn't feel like the one left out. I felt like the one who escaped. There is a difference. When you stop trying to belong to a version of family that only values you when you're quiet and compliant. You don't just feel excluded, you feel free, and freedom is addictive. That weekend, I bought tickets to a design exhibition in New York that I'd always wanted to attend, but never made time for. I stayed in a small boutique hotel in Soho, walked for hours, and sat through panels led by architects I had admired since I was 19. No one there knew my last name or asked about my family. They only asked about my work, my process, my ideas. And every time someone introduced themselves, I realized how much easier it is to be seen by strangers than to be unseen by people who claim to love you. On the final day of the trip, I got a message from my Aunt Valerie, my father's sister. We hadn't spoken in over a year. Her text was short, just heard some things. Wanted to say I see you. That's all. I didn't reply right away. I didn't know what to say, but something inside me softened. Maybe not everything was broken. Maybe not everyone had chosen the easy narrative. When I returned to Chicago, I brought back a new sketchbook, full of notes and ideas and fragments of things I wanted to build. Not buildings, not homes, not even spaces, but something else, something internal. I wasn't just sketching walls anymore. I was sketching boundaries, the kind no one else could cross without invitation. I wasn't healed. I wasn't above it, but I was becoming someone who no longer needed to be chosen. I was learning how to choose myself. It had been almost a month since the wedding livestream text, and by then, the absence of communication had become its own form of clarity. No one from my family followed up, not even with a hollow message about how they missed me or hoped I was doing well. That silence told me more than any voicemail could. It confirmed what I already knew, that I had been edited out so cleanly. They didn't even think I would notice. But what they hadn't calculated was how little I missed them back. When someone stops pretending to love you, you stop pretending to need them. I started spending more time with the people who actually showed up, the ones who never asked me to shrink or soften to fit into their comfort zones. Danielle, my neighbor and longtime friend, started inviting me to weekly dinners again. We would cook together, complain about the news, swap stories about difficult clients and awkward meetings, and sometimes sit in silence without it feeling empty. Those nights weren't extravagant or dramatic, but they were honest. That was something I hadn't realized I'd been craving until I finally had it, around that same time. I was invited to co-lead a mentorship program at work. It wasn't a promotion, not formally, but it came with influence I had earned. I met with young designers just entering the field, people still shaky about their voices, unsure if they were allowed to take up space, and as I guided them, answered their questions, helped them shape their portfolios, I saw pieces of my younger self in all of them. The version of me who had once whispered ideas because she didn't know if anyone would care. Now I was the one listening. I didn't say anything profound. I didn't tell them to believe in themselves. I just showed up, week after week, steady, present, unapologetic. One of the newer associates, a quiet girl named Marisol, asked me once how I knew I belonged in this field. I looked at her, thought about it, and said I didn't. So I worked until the room forgot I was optional. It wasn't about talent. It was about resilience. And I realized in that moment, I didn't need applause or permission. I just needed to keep building. That same week, I received a handwritten note at the office. It was forwarded from my parents' address, no return name, just an elegant envelope with my name written in careful cursive. Inside was a folded card and a single line. "We should talk. There's more you don't know." It wasn't signed, but I recognized the handwriting. It was Wesley's. I sat there holding the card like it might burn a hole in my hand. I hadn't thought about him much since the wedding. Honestly, I tried not to. He was part of a chapter I had already decided not to reread. But curiosity has its own gravity. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. 2 days later, I got a message request from him on a private platform I barely used anymore. He wrote, "I won't reach out again if you don't want me to. But I feel like you deserve context. Things didn't happen the way you think they did." I stared at the screen for what felt like hours. Not because I wanted closure, but because, for the first time, someone from their side had broken the line. Someone had stepped out of the script. I didn't reply that day, or the next, but I didn't block him either. Instead, I kept working. I presented a new concept for the Lakeside Pavilion project that got immediate approval from the client. Dana pulled me aside afterward and said, "Whatever you're doing lately, keep doing it." It wasn't just validation. It was a mirror. Something inside me had shifted. I wasn't just building designs. I was rebuilding my own blueprint, one that didn't rely on being seen by the wrong people, one that didn't need a family name to feel legitimate. That Friday, I went back to my favorite coffee shop, the one I used to avoid, because it was too close to Taylor's college campus. I sat by the window, ordered a cappuccino, and opened a new sketchbook. No plans, no pressure, just white pages waiting for what I wanted to make next. And somewhere between the first and third page, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Control, not over people, but over myself. The kind of quiet, internal control that doesn't ask for attention. It just exists. I wasn't healed, but I was no longer waiting for their invitation. And when someone stops waiting to be included, they become impossible to erase. The unraveling didn't happen all at once. It started slowly, like a thread being tugged from a tightly sewn hem, small and almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. The first sign came from Riley, my cousin, who called one evening and said in a tone too casual to be accidental, "Just thought you should know your dad looked like he wanted to be anywhere else during the father-daughter dance. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need them. I knew what it meant. For people like my father, image is currency. If he had finally started slipping behind the curtain, even for a second, something had gone off script." I thanked her and hung up, and that should have been the end of it. But then a week later, I received a message from Mitchell, one of Taylor's longtime friends, someone I used to bump into at family events before he faded into her orbit entirely. His message was careful, like someone crossing a frozen lake they weren't sure would hold, just between us. The energy at the reception was off. People were tense. A few folks asked where you were, and the answers kept changing. He paused, then added, "Wesley didn't look like someone getting everything he wanted, just someone trying to get through it." That last line stayed with me. I hadn't thought about Wesley in weeks, maybe months. He had become a shadow in a story I no longer cared to revisit. But hearing his name again, not as gossip, but as a quiet observation, made something shift inside me. I didn't feel bitter. I didn't feel regret. I felt detached, and in that detachment, there was a strange sort of power, because when someone no longer has the ability to shake your peace, you've already won. That same week, work had taken on a rhythm that felt less like survival and more like momentum. I was in meetings that used to intimidate me, now offering opinions without flinching. My proposals weren't just being accepted, they were setting the tone for larger conversations. Dana pulled me aside after one client pitch and said, "I don't know what's different with you lately, but whatever it is, it's working." I smiled, not because I had a clever answer, but because I didn't need one. The truth was simple. I had finally stopped trying to earn love from people who only loved versions of me that made their lives easier. That kind of freedom doesn't come with a grand gesture. It sneaks in during quiet choices, saying no to calls that drain you, choosing not to defend yourself in conversations you never consented to, walking into a room without wondering who will understand your story. One morning, I opened an email from a design magazine asking if I'd be interested in doing a short feature on my studio's adaptive reuse projects. It wasn't front page exposure, but it was enough to make me pause. They had found me, not through a recommendation, not through networking, through the work, through the consistent, undeniable quality of what I'd built, while everyone else was too busy curating a family fairy tale. That evening, I sat by my window with a glass of wine, watching the city light reflect off the glass towers downtown, and I thought about all the ways I used to beg for a seat at a table that was never built for me. Not once, not directly, but in every tiny concession I made. Every time I swallowed my voice to keep the peace. Every time I let Taylor shine even when the light was mine. I had made myself small so they wouldn't feel threatened, and then they called me invisible. But now, without asking, the world had started seeing me anyway, and I realized something I wish someone had told me years ago. You don't have to be dramatic to reclaim your power. You just have to stop apologizing for having it. I never responded to Wesley. I never asked what went wrong between him and Taylor, or why his eyes looked dull in every photo people quietly forwarded my way. I didn't need to. His silence had been an answer long before his words ever could be. People often think justice looks like confrontation, but sometimes it looks like living well, with no need to explain a thing. And in that kind of life, there is no room for permission. There's only truth. The call came on a Sunday afternoon, just as I was returning from the farmer's market with a tote full of tulips and overpriced cheese. The kind of quiet ritual I had come to love since my calendar no longer revolved around people who only remembered me when it was convenient. I let the call go to voicemail when I saw it was my mother. Then a second call came in, followed by a third, this time from my father's phone. I didn't answer that one either. I stood in my kitchen with my coat still on, the flowers half unwrapped on the counter, staring at my phone as though it had the power to rewind the last year. It didn't. I finally played the voicemail. My mother's voice was low, not like she was whispering, but like she had rehearsed this version of herself that sounded calm and unbothered. She said Bianca and Wesley were taking some time apart, and that things had gotten complicated, and that it might be a good time for the family to come together again. I didn't laugh, though a smile tugged at the edge of my mouth. The timing was almost cinematic. The same people who had built an entire wedding without me, who had spun narratives to justify my absence, who had celebrated my erasure with full makeup and monogrammed programs, were now circling back like I was a spare piece they could reinstall when the first one cracked. I didn't call back. I went about my day, arranged the tulips in a jar I had picked up from a vintage shop, cooked dinner, and let the silence between us stretch into something purposeful. The next day, I got a text from Taylor. It was short. I don't know what you heard, but I'd appreciate it if you didn't tell people what's going on. No context, No acknowledgement of the year-long wall between us. Just another attempt at control disguised as a boundary. I didn't respond. I didn't need to, because what she didn't understand was that I hadn't told anyone anything. I didn't have to. People had eyes. They saw what happened, and more importantly, they saw who didn't. A week later, I ran into Aunt Linda again, this time in person, at an architecture panel downtown. She gave me a long look, then said without preamble, "You're glowing in a way that only comes after someone finally stops chasing people who keep running away." I laughed because it was true. There was no makeup or vacation tan or new haircut. There was just peace, layered and earned like good insulation. She sat next to me during the talk, then asked if I wanted to grab a drink afterward, over glasses of wine in a quiet corner of a rooftop bar. She told me that several relatives had come back from the wedding, feeling unsettled, not because of anything obvious, just the energy, the way Taylor looked tense even when smiling, how Wesley kept checking his watch, how my parents seemed overcompensating every time someone mentioned my name. It's like they were performing one version of your absence to the crowd and holding on to another version privately. She said, "That kind of emotional juggling wears thin fast." I nodded, not because I needed confirmation, but because it was nice to hear someone name the thing I had learned to live around. A few days later, I got another message, this time from Wesley. He didn't apologize. He didn't offer explanations. He just wrote, "I made a mess of things. You didn't deserve to be caught in it." It was the first thing he'd ever said that didn't sound like it was filtered through Taylor or my parents. I didn't reply. I didn't delete it either. I let it sit in my inbox like a small, quiet artifact of who I used to be to them. Then I moved on. Work picked up. A feature on my firm's latest project was published in a local design journal. And for the first time, my name was credited as lead designer without needing to ask. I walked into meetings where people knew who I was before I spoke. I was invited to a panel of emerging female architects under 35, and when I stood in front of that audience, telling my story about designing from a place of personal resilience, I didn't mention my family, not once, not because they didn't shape me, but because they no longer defined me. That was the real shift. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need them to hurt. I just needed to stop living like their silence had the power to cancel out my voice. And the moment I did, everything started sounding clear again. It wasn't a dramatic moment or some grand twist that marked the turning point. It was an email, a simple one, sent by a woman named Claudia from a design conference I had forgotten I applied to speak at months ago. She wrote, "We'd love to feature your story on navigating design, career, and family identity. You've built something that resonates." I read the message 3 times, not because I didn't understand it, but because something about it felt too honest, too aligned. The version of me that used to exist would have paused, wondered if talking about family so publicly was petty, worried about how it might make people uncomfortable. But the version sitting at my desk in that moment had already lived through silence that cut deeper than confrontation ever could. So I said yes. I spent the next 2 weeks drafting my keynote. I didn't use names. I didn't air dirty laundry. I told the story of a woman who had spent years designing beautiful, functional spaces while silently trying to survive a personal structure that was anything but stable. I spoke about the invisible labor of being the peacekeeper, the easy child, the one who shows up on time, works hard, and doesn't make waves, and how quietly that role can strip you of your voice. I practiced my talk in front of Danielle one night, nervous not because I was afraid of public speaking, but because this was the first time I was telling my story out loud, all of it, without leaving out the parts that hurt. When I finished, she looked at me and said, "It doesn't sound like a speech. It sounds like truth." That gave me more courage than applause ever could. The day of the conference, I arrived early, wearing a simple black blouse and slacks I had tailored months ago, but never found an occasion for. The room wasn't huge, maybe 50 people, but it felt like a full stadium in my chest. I stood behind the podium, took a breath, and began. I talked about architecture. I talked about absence. I talked about how sometimes the most beautiful structures are the ones that allow for space, space to feel, space to breathe, space to be seen. I ended with one line I hadn't written down, but felt right in the moment. I said, "You don't have to burn the house down. You just have to stop living in rooms that were never built for you." The applause came slowly, then steadily, but what mattered more were the quiet conversations afterward, women who pulled me aside to say, "I thought it was just me," a man who told me, "You described my daughter. I think I finally get it now," even a teenage intern who whispered, "I sent that line to my mom just now." It wasn't revenge. It wasn't vindication. It was resonance. And that felt better than anything else. That night, as I sat in a hotel room overlooking the river, phone on airplane mode, I thought about how many years I had spent trying to explain myself to people who never intended to understand. And now, with no explanations, strangers understood anyway. It's funny how healing doesn't always arrive in the form of apologies. Sometimes it looks like relevance. Sometimes it looks like your name appearing on a program, not because someone did you a favor, but because you earned the place. The next morning, I checked my phone and found a message from my father. I could tell he hadn't written it quickly. The grammar was careful, the tone uncertain. "Your mother showed me your speech online. I didn't know how much you had been carrying. I think we made some mistakes. No specific apology, no mention of Taylor, but something about it felt like an edge softening. And that was enough." I didn't respond, not because I didn't appreciate it, but because it didn't require a reply. Some doors don't need to be slammed. They just need to be closed with intention. When I returned to Chicago, I walked straight to my studio and opened a fresh project file. New structure, new space, no edits, no compromises. For the first time, I was designing something entirely mine, with no ghost of expectation hovering behind me. And in that room, with morning light pouring through the high windows and no voices telling me who to be, I felt like the architect of more than a building. I felt like the architect of my own life. The moment I saw her walk through the studio door, I knew it wasn't about business. Taylor never stepped into any space that wasn't centered around her unless something had broken and she couldn't control the narrative anymore. She stood there quietly, shoulders smaller than I remembered, coat too thick for the mild Chicago air, eyes scanning the walls like they were memories she wasn't sure she had permission to look at. I didn't say a word. I waited. She finally spoke, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "I thought maybe I could see what you've built." I nodded, not as an invitation, but as acknowledgement. She stepped further inside and looked around like she was visiting a life she once thought wouldn't survive without her approval. After a long pause, she said, "I heard about the keynote and the magazine feature. People keep forwarding me things." I didn't respond, not because I was being cold, but because none of this was about her anymore. That, I realized, was the real shift. My growth had become undeniable, and it wasn't fueled by spite or the need to prove her wrong. It was simply happening, with or without her permission. Taylor walked over to a model I had been working on and gently ran her finger along its edge. "I've been thinking about that night," she said, and I knew which night she meant. The wedding. The night she looked radiant in photographs built on the absence of the one person who had always shown up, even when unacknowledged. "It wasn't what it looked like," she added, and for a second I almost laughed. But I didn't. I let her keep going. Wesley and I didn't even last 3 months. He said something one morning over breakfast. "You plan beautiful events, Taylor, but you don't know how to live in them." That was the last honest thing he ever said to me. I felt a flicker of something, maybe sympathy, maybe just fatigue. Not because I wanted her to suffer, but because watching someone finally confront the emptiness of a performance they wrote themselves into is its own kind of sadness. I thought if I made it perfect, people would stop asking about you. I thought I could make it make sense. I looked at her now, not as a sister who had wronged me, but as a person who was still trying to decorate a structure built on denial. "Why are you really here?" I asked. Taylor hesitated, then finally said, "Because you made something solid, and I don't know how. You always made it look easy. But I know now it wasn't." I exhaled, slow and full. It wasn't. It was lonely and humiliating and quiet, and I kept going anyway. That's the part no one saw. She looked down, then back at me. "I'm sorry." The words were small, unsure, but real, still. I didn't rush to accept them. I didn't brush them away either. I let them land where they may, not as closure, but as acknowledgement. "You don't need to apologize to feel bad," I said, "but you do need to live with what you built." She nodded, and for once, didn't try to explain herself. She just said, "You don't have to let me back in. I just needed you to know I see it now." I nodded once. That was enough. When she left, the door closed gently behind her, and the air in the studio felt exactly the same. I didn't feel shaken. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt still. The next morning, I stood in front of my team, presenting our newest pitch to a client who had followed our work for months. Midway through the presentation, I caught a glimpse of myself in the glass panel behind them, not the reflection of who I had to be to survive my family, but the clear, grounded woman who had slowly built something no one could dismiss. That night, I walked home without checking my phone, without wondering what anyone thought, without needing to rewrite history. The past hadn't disappeared, but it no longer controlled the lighting in the room. I had designed my way out of the dark, and now there was nothing left to prove, only space to keep building. A few months after Taylor left the studio that day, I was invited to speak at a symposium hosted by a National Design Institute. The topic was resilience and reinvention in design. I stood backstage that morning, looking out at a packed hall full of students, architects, and thinkers from across the country. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't chasing approval. I felt still, anchored. I had earned this moment not through revenge or public recognition, but through a quiet and consistent commitment to building a life that could stand on its own. I began my talk not with a quote, but with a memory of standing in my kitchen, phone in hand, reading the words, "Watch your sister's wedding" online. I told them how that moment didn't destroy me. It revealed the foundation I had been standing on for years without questioning. And once it cracked, I had a choice, collapse or rebuild. I shared how pain is often the first honest architect we meet, how betrayal clears space faster than clarity ever could. But what matters is what you build in that space. What matters is whether you make it a stage, a shelter, or a boundary. I spoke for 20 minutes, not about my family, not even about my work, but about the freedom that comes when you stop asking people to see you and start designing spaces that reflect who you already are. When I stepped off stage, people clapped, but more than that, they looked at me not with admiration, but with connection, and that, to me, was everything. A week later, I received an unexpected email. It was from a high school in my hometown asking if I would speak to their graduating class. Apparently, one of the faculty had seen my talk and recognized my name. I hadn't set foot in that school since the day I left for college. But something about it felt right, like a quiet return, not to prove anything, but to reclaim a place in my own story I accepted on the day of the event. I stood outside the auditorium before the students filed in. It still smelled like waxed floors and cheap vending machine snacks. For a moment, I thought about the version of me who once sat in those plastic chairs, sketching floor plans in the margins of math tests, wondering if any of it would matter. And then I walked in. I didn't give them advice. I told them a story. I said, sometimes, the people who claim to know you best will be the first to deny you. Not because you're wrong, but because your growth scares them. Your clarity disrupts their comfort. That's not a reason to shrink. That's the start of your expansion. After the talk, a girl about 17 approached me and said, "My mom told me to stop dreaming so big. She said people like us don't get picked." I looked at her and said, "Then build something they can't ignore, and don't wait for them to clap." She smiled, not in defiance, but in relief. That was when I understood fully this entire journey had never been about proving anyone wrong. It had been about learning to move without waiting for permission. Months later, I sat alone on the rooftop of my building, Chicago lights glowing below, thinking about how far I had come, not in terms of money or fame, but peace, freedom, wholeness. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. I opened it. It was a photo of Taylor, standing in front of a small community center with a banner that read, "Free Arts for Girls." The caption was short, "Starting again. Thought of you." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. I wished her well silently and put the phone away, because I wasn't living in reaction anymore. I wasn't editing myself based on what people missed or misunderstood. I had already built the thing, the structure, the space, the life, a life that began with silence and ended in resonance. That's the thing no one tells you sometimes. The loudest victory is simply living well and not needing anyone to witness it to make it real. I didn't need a public apology. I didn't need them to admit they were wrong. I just needed to know I was right to keep going. And I was, in the end. The real architecture wasn't what I built in the city. It was what I built inside myself.